Hi guys, and welcome to another Wargame Red Dragon tutorial video with me, Bubblebox, and today we're going to be having a look at the artillery. Now the artillery units are units that can fire from long distances to very long distances, up to very, very long distances, and also they can fire over obstacles. They normally fire with high explosive rounds, but a few can also fire armor piercing like cluster rocket type rounds, and a few also have napalm rocket attacks now as well, which I find very, very useful. So what are the different types? Well, there's four different types of artillery really. There's the mortars that we can see here in the foreground. There's the rocket artillery, which we can see in the middle here, some different types of those. And then you've got the sort of classical looking artillery pieces, which can be grouped into two different subtypes, I suppose. You've got your barrage artillery, which tend to be sort of medium range, high dispersion type units, and then you've got your tube artillery, which seem to be extremely long range and very accurate and precise type artillery units. And each of these units has their uses, and each of these units have their downsizes. And I think it's really useful in this game to know how to use your artillery properly. So just like the other tutorials, I'm going to have a look at the USA deck and the USSR deck artillery pieces, just for examples of one of each side. But first of all, I think it's good to go over a couple of general points that go for all artillery. The first is that all artillery have a minimum and a maximum range. So for example, these sort of barrage type artillery, they've got quite a short minimum range, so you can fire at units quite close by actually, and they've got and their range goes out and out and out and out, and then you'll hit a maximum range over which you'll have to move your units forward in order to fire. But still a pretty decent damned range there for those units. Another example would be these Uragans, or however you pronounce that. These have quite a minimum range. You can see it goes up quite a long way. We're talking what, 6,000 7,000 meters, pretty much 7,000 meter minimum range. So these couldn't target anything inside this kind of radius, so these need to be kept well back behind the lines just to be able to use them really. So it's worth just having a look at and just checking out the minimum and maximum ranges of your artillery when you think about where you're going to be firing them from, what units you're going to be firing them onto, and stuff like that. Also, the size of the area which the artillery impact varies according to two things. Basically, their dispersion value and their line of sight. And the dispersion value is the radius in which the artillery will drop their shells. So if we have a look at the BM1 Grad to start with, you can see that the dispersion here, and so this is the area in which this Grad will drop all its shells all at once. And you can see that with these rocket artillery, and this goes for all rocket artillery, the dispersion effect increases as you, if I just go there a bit, whoops, not too far, the dispersion effect increases as you increase the distance from the unit. So the closer you are, the better the dispersion effect. So it's best if you want to like hit a load of, for example, infantry units in a building, it's best to get your units as close to those buildings as you can, so you can get as many as your rockets hitting the infantry in those buildings as you can. It's no good having a dispersion effect all the way over here like this if you're just going to hit those few buildings in there, because the vast majority, 95% of your rockets, are going to miss anyway. And the same goes for the Uragan. As you can see, the dispersion bubble, if you like, or radius gets bigger the further the target is from your unit. So to get optimum effects from the rocket artillery, it sometimes needs a little bit of microing backwards and forwards, I guess, if you got the patience to do that. However, for the barrage and the tube artillery, the opposite is true. So for the barrage and the tube artillery, the distance from the unit has very little effect on the dispersion value where the shells are going to line. are going to land basically. And so if you have a look for the marker as well, fire position, and you can see nice tight circle up close, and also if you go even to right over to maximum distance, there's still a very precise tight circle of dispersion at that point as well. So these guys can be used way back to attack very precisely units way across the map. And the same is for the mortars as well. The distance doesn't have any effect on the dispersion value. Another important concept is having line of sight on your enemy. If you have some line of sight for some types of artillery, then you get a tighter dispersion. We'll start off with the barrage artillery. With the barrage artillery, and this goes for the tube artillery as well, if you've got line of sight, it tightens up your dispersion. So if we fired on these buildings over here, we've got no line of sight anywhere in or around these buildings. You can see how great our dispersion value is. But we've got an Mi-26 parked over here, and you can see as soon as we go over the Mi-26, our dispersion value really tightens up, and it'll also tighten up in any areas of the buildings where that Mi-26 has a line of sight as well. But it's important to scroll around buildings, because on some parts you'll see it will expand, and on other parts it will get small where the Mi-26 can actually see. Now the opposite is true for the rocket artillery, and this again goes for the Uragans and for these Grads here, and for all types of rocket artillery. This time, and I'll just show you as well, you can have a line of sight over here, sorry, no line of sight over here, and you can see the dispersion effect over here, and you've got a line of sight over here, and you can see the dispersion effect is actually exactly the same. So line of sight doesn't have an effect on the dispersion value for rocket artillery. It does for the other types of artillery, and that includes for mortars. So if we've got these known as highlighted again, so you can see the dispersion value over this area here, and then if we scroll over to the Mi-26, you can see how that tightens up around the buildings as well. Again, you've got to pick the right place in the buildings where the Mi-26 has actually got a line of sight in order to get that tight dispersion value for the mortars. Smoke is another important concept when it comes to using artillery. The barrage artillery, because they've got a high dispersion, will spread their smoke around, whereas the types of artillery with a smaller radius of dispersion will have their smoke land in a much tighter spot. So just to show that off, if I fire the Akatsayas over onto this position, so I'll smoke these buildings here with those guys, and then I can compare that to the Malkas, which we can fire on a building close by, so we can smoke this position. And while they're firing, we'll have a quick look at the Nonas as well, with their fairly tight kind of smoke. Can't quite reach up to those buildings, so we'll just do those over here. And I'll speed it up so we can have a look at the effects of their smoke. So you can see that the barrage type artillery spread their smoke around, which is quite useful, whereas the Malkas, unless you want to smoke a very specific position, and that can be useful in some circumstances, but often you want to smoke quite a large area without using supply up. That's quite useful, quite a good use of barrage artillery perhaps over the more expensive types of tube artillery. And the mortars are quite efficient at smoking as well, because they could have such a high ammunition load, and their resupply costs aren't too great as well, so it doesn't cost much to smoke from these small mortar type units. Now, a couple more things that's definitely worth knowing about before I start moving on to have a look at the American and the Soviet units is, first of all, counter-battery fire. Now, you can always see the enemy when they're firing their artillery, and they can also see your artillery when it's firing for the time in which it's firing. So for example, if it fires quite quickly, maybe they won't get a chance to see where it is, whereas if it's firing quite a long salvo, often they will spot it and they will counter battery your artillery with their artillery, especially if they're good players. They will always do that. The only way round this is to counter-battery them when they fire their artillery, and also to move your units every time they fire. So it's quite micro intensive, but competent players can pretty much remember to do this, I would hope. Even if you just move them a short distance, so if you've got, say, a fob, you can just move your units around the radius of the fob. You've only got to move them like a little bit of distance to get them out of the range of the artillery of the enemy. And the best type of artillery for counter battery fire, I would say, are the tube artillery, because you want something that's going to be accurate over a long distance against something where you probably don't have a line of sight. Another thing to remember is there will be a time lag between when you fire your artillery and when its shells land. So of course this is going to be longer for the more sort of highly ranged units, and less for the units like the mortars, which will just pretty much land as soon as they fire almost. So mortars can be useful for supporting attacks and for also supporting defences against moving lines, but things like tube artilleries are pretty useless if you are trying to fire them on moving targets. And finally, in this little bit of the video, remember, don't ever put your artillery near your commands, because if they counter battery, they're going to hit your command vehicle. And they require quite a lot of micromanagement as well. So let's move on to the artillery pieces, the barrage and the tube artillery of the Russians and the Americans. And we're going to start off with the Russians. So the basic model for the Russians is one of these Gvozditska, so however you pronounce that. So this is your most basic one you can get for the Russians. I'm not going to talk about the secondary weapons again. Don't really want these engaging on the front line, so you'll probably be leaving these well behind your front line and only be using these secondary weapons if you get into a bit of bother with these units. So we've got a sort of a fairly, for an artillery unit, a fairly average kind of range. Quite a large dispersion, 7,000, that's a pretty big dispersion value there. HE power is 6, which isn't brilliant for an artillery piece. Remember, you're only paying 60 for this. And pretty poor, sort of okay-ish sort of suppression. Speed, not too bad. Autonomy, not too bad. Pretty average. Road speed, standard. It is actually amphibious, this one, which I didn't notice before. And it's got 1111 armour as well. Then you've got the one we had a look at earlier in the video, the Akatsaya. This isn't massively different from the Gvozditska, in that the range is fairly similar. It's slightly higher. The dispersion is actually slightly worse, so you've got a slightly better range, slightly worse dispersion. It's got a better HE power, slightly of 7 over 6, and a slightly better suppression rate. Fires 3 rounds per minute, whereas this one's slightly faster and fires at 4 rounds per minute. They both cost the same. You're just sort of up and down a little bit with the stats there, and it's got very similar. The rest of the stats at the bottom here are pretty much almost identical, apart from the speed off-road here, which is slightly less for the Akatsaya. Next, we've got the upgrade of the Akatsaya. Oh, I can almost say it now. The 253M. For your upgrade, you get a machine gun first of all, which isn't going to be that useful. Sorry, you get a good main gun, which isn't going to be that useful either. Then you've got slightly better range, slightly better dispersion, but still not brilliant. HE power of 7. Which is exactly the same. 350 suppression, exactly the same. So you're paying a bit more, you're getting a bit more range, a bit better dispersion, slightly higher fire rate. Rest of the stats pretty much the same. Then we've got the misters. Now the misters are quite expensive, 130, and in fact they're the most expensive, although I don't think they're quite the best Red 4 unit, but they are the most expensive, and I think it's because they've got all these secondaries and things which I'd never use anyway. Got a very long range, 29,000. A decent dispersion, still not the best, but it's okay, of 5,400. An okay HE power and an okay suppression of, decent suppression of 350. A decent off-road speed. But it's got some nice armour. It's got 5 front armour, 3 side armour, 2 back armor and 2 top armor, so it can take a little bit of counter battery fire before it will die. So that's one of the advantages of this, but it's still got not got the best gun in the world, despite having this armor and being quite sort of strong in a defensive, more defensive kind of role. Then we've got the Peon and the Malka. Now these are quite nice guns and what a lot of people would use, especially the Malka. We'll have a look at the Peon first. So the Peon, if we compare it to the most expensive unit, it's got a longer range, it's got a tighter dispersion, it's got a better HE power, it's got a better suppression, it's got a low fire rate, whereas the Mister has got quite a high fire rate. So that's an advantage to Mr. Scott, but everything else is worse. And as I would probably use these units mainly for sniping, you want to really get the tight dispersion and the high HE power with these units, I feel. I don't know, I might be wrong, I haven't really experimented too much, but that's how I feel anyway. Rest of the stats fairly similar, slightly worse off-road speed. Then we've got the upgrade of the Peon, and I'm going to keep the Mister up, and we've got the Malka next. So the Malka is probably the one I take in my normally only over the Mister, because I don't want these secondary weapons. I just think you're paying for secondary weapons you're never ever going to use. And look, you can fire this to anywhere on the map. Okay, and if you've got two of these guys in a pair of these guys, they're going to be able to snipe most things around the map if you can get eyes on them and get a nice tight dispersion, because it has already got a dispersion and you can improve on that by having eyes on the target as well. It's got a fantastic HE power for an artillery piece of 10, very good suppression, and a fire rate of 2 rounds per minute. So the only downside is the fire rate, really, over and above the Mister. The armor's not so good, of course, as the Mister, so you're going to have to keep this safe, because if you get some heavy HE power artillery shells landing on top of this guy, it's, you know, you could easily take it out. It's only got, even though it has a strength of 10. So yeah, that's your Malka, probably one of the better guns. I'd class it above the 130 point Mister, really, but the only advantage, as I say, is the armor with the Mister, I guess. Next, we've got the American artillery. So we'll start off with the basic model, and really the basic model's kind of like the basic model for the Russians, really. You got averagey sort of range, very large dispersion, okay kind of HE power, okay kind of suppression, secondary gun that don't do nothing, and then we've got a strength of 10, speeds, they're all very similar, quite a poor autonomy. Not that you're going to be moving these around long distances on maps, I guess. It's got a little bit of armor as well if it's targeted. Then we've got the upgrade to that, the M109A2. So what do you get for your money? For your extra 30 points extra, actually, you get a much longer range. You get a better dispersion, still not fantastic, but it's better, and the rest of the stats are pretty much the same. Even the stats down here are pretty much the same as well. So yeah, you get a better range, better dispersion. Again, they're still not brilliant, and the gun is pretty much the same as it was on the previous model. Then we've got our Paladins. Now the Paladins aren't too shabby at all. They've got a nice long range, a nice tight dispersion. The HE power isn't the best, but it's okay at 7, and the suppression's pretty decent, but not the best, but pretty decent actually at 357. And it's got a little bit, but not too much armor. Again, it can't take too much punishment if it's targeted. But pretty nice, but probably the best artillery piece the Americans have, but certainly not up to the standard of the Mister and the Malka of the Red 4 side of the Russians. Then we've got these howitzer type weapons, the M110 and the M110A2 upgrade. So they cost 70 points and 90 points respectively. Only 2 rounds, so basically you grab them next to a fob or a chopper, or they're just not ever going to get resupplied. So you've got your basic one here with a range of 16.8, then you upgrade with a much longer range. You got your dispersion, the upgrade, better dispersion. Then you've got the gun, exactly the same, 10 HE power, which is good, and 467 suppression, which is good as well. And then the rest of the stats exactly the same, 50 Ks off-road for moving it around. One's got a slightly better autonomy, the M110. Oh, but this is definitely a better gun. It's got a longer range, much better dispersion for sniping units. So yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I'll let you guys decide what you think the best is and experiment in your games and stuff like that. So moving on to the rocket artillery, and the first one we're going to have a look at is probably the most basic one for the Russians, is the BM-21 Grad. Now these aren't the most useful weapons in the world, especially when they're used singly. They're a lot better if they're used in a clump of maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 of these guys, but then it gets quite expensive to use them. They've got a medium sort of range for artillery, an okay-ish dispersion of 4,550. The HE power isn't brilliant. Remember, these rockets are spread all over the place, and the suppression isn't fantastic. The rate of fire is pretty high though. So they're just useful really for just suppressing units. They're not going to kill a lot, but they are useful for suppressing units. Then we've got the Uragans. Uragans are a bit better. They've got a longer range. They've got a much better HE power of 11, so they maybe will kill something. The suppression effect's a lot better as well. 16 rounds. They are expensive, I think, probably for what they are. They've got a slightly better dispersion, I think, than the Grads. They're definitely a nice upgrade to the Grads. They've got a strength of 10 this time. Again, the armour is very limiting on these guys. They've got a very high road speed. That is extremely high, 150 k's for a lorry. And an okay off-road speed. Autonomy is not too bad. So, yeah. I mean, I see a lot of new players use like these HE rockets, and because they look really nice, they look effective, but they're not that effective, to be honest. Now, then we've got these Smersh. Now, these rocket artillery are now able to fire cluster rockets that do AP damage, and these are very powerful because they've got an AP power of 8. Which doesn't sound too high, but when you've got 12 of them raining down, then they can do some damage if a couple of the rockets hit. And remember, they're hitting from above, so they're going to be intercepting the top armour of armoured vehicles. So they are going to be able to do damage even with an AP power of 8. Suppression's not too bad either. The rate of fire is quite slow, and the thing about this is the reload times is excruciatingly long. I mean, you get a shot, a salvo off with this, you won't be able to fire it again for another 5 minutes, I reckon. I've never counted it, but it's got to be at least 5 minutes before you can get another salvo off. So they are very effective. If you can get, like, if someone's grouped 4 tanks together or something, and you can get a shot with these, with a sort of, then take the shot, because you're going to do major damage to those tanks. But the reload time is very long. They're also extremely supply heavy, as are all the rocket artillery. All the rocket artillery will suck a fob dry in no time. And the thing that will really get on your teammates' nerves, if you run your fob dry and then drive your rocket artillery to their fob and start slurping on their supplies as well. There's nothing worse than that, to be honest. So they're the Smershes, nice, powerful. Now the Americans have got their own version of these AP powered rocket artillery, and they're called the Attackums. Now these are pretty much, yeah, they are pretty much rockets basically, like ballistic rockets with armor piercing shells inside them, I guess. They've got a very, very tight dispersion, 910. I mean, that's an insanely small dispersion. And a massive suppression as well, and a huge AP power of 20. Now they only fire 2 rounds, but they're going to hit what they're firing out as long as what they're firing at is static. They're not well armoured, and they've got a strength of 10, so if they do receive counter battery fire, they're going to die. So you need to move these things. They're very expensive at 150. Fire them, move them out of the way somewhere safe ready. They also, both the Smersh and the Attackums have got quite a long minimum range, so on small maps they can be quite difficult to use because they just get too close. They're already too close to the enemy to be used basically, so just bear that in mind if you're using these on small maps as well. So that's the American and Russian rocket artillery. Now there are a couple of other there's a lot of other interesting ones, but a couple to highlight might be these. There's a West German Mars which also fires AP rounds, so that's quite an interesting one. And another one which I really do want to highlight are these Chinese PHL 63 and the Chinese PHZ 70. So I'll just pin that and we'll have a look at these. Now these are interesting because yes, look, they fire napalm rounds, and this is, I'm finding these units are very, very useful in either a Chinese deck or a coalition deck with the Chinese, I think it's Chinese and North Koreans rather. Now they've got two of these. They've got a 50.1 and an 80.1. The 50.1 fires less rounds basically than the 80.1, although the rest of the stats are very, very similar. And these are useful because you can just keep them behind your lines and keep pushing forward your infantry and your armoured vehicles, and burning out any of their infantry from tree lines, from forests, from buildings and stuff like that, stunning them and sending your infantry in to try to finish them off. And they are much, much safer, these napalm rocket launchers, than using aircraft. It's, you know, because they might have any number of anti-aircraft, and you can use these napalm launchers. You don't have to worry about sending in napalm planes, basically. So very, very useful units, worth having a look at, especially if you're using Chinese or the Chinese and North Korean coalition deck. Very useful indeed. So that's about it really for the rocket artillery, apart from one other thing to say generally about artillery, and that's something no one else ever mentions in tutorials, and that is using artillery against ships. Now artillery, if used correctly against ships, can be, it's not going to be devastating, but it can buy you time if you're in trouble on the water, and it can chip away at their ships' kind of strengths, so that it gives your ships a better chance against their ships. Now what sort of rocket arty can you use against ships? Well, you can use even the HE rocket, as long as you fire a lot of it and you've got a big clump of ships, you can suppress those ships while your ships are attacking those ships. Other artillery, the ATACMS and the all the AP firing rocket artillery will do damage even to individual ships if they've got a tight, because they've got quite tight dispersions, so you can even hit those larger ships if they're on their own even with the AP powered artillery, and you will take good strength points away from those ships just using, especially the ATACMS, if you can get a couple of rockets to land on top of a ship, can do a lot of damage. So yeah, so it's worth using artillery, perhaps as a last resort, a little bit in a defensive position against ships. If say your teammates are mainly pushing on the land and doing really well on the land, and they've spawned a load of ships at the start, just use some artillery and just bombard their ships just to keep them at bay while you're getting points together for other stuff like, you know, anti-ship planes and stuff like that. So anyway, I digress into ship warfare. That's a topic for another tutorial. So that's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and I hope you got something out of it. Please do comment, like and subscribe, especially comment really, because it's nice to hear from people out there that are watching the videos and get some comments on them. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.